In this topic for Module 4, we're going to talk very briefly about the Constitution and slavery. First, I'll give you a little background information on the role of African Americans in the Revolutionary War. Talk very briefly about the first emancipation movement in that post-Revolutionary War period. We'll look at the impact of the Northwest Ordinance in the immediate aftermath of the Revolutionary War, as Americans try to deal with this whole question of slavery in the Western Territories for the first time. This will in many ways set a pattern for the way in which the American government attempts to deal with slavery in the Western Territories in the early 1800s. So you go from the Northwest Ordinance of the late 1700s to the other attempts to legislate slavery either in or out of the Western Territories as more territory is added to the United States. And then finally, we'll talk about the Constitution of 1789 and what provisions are made for slavery, the institution of slavery, or for slaves in the new government beginning in 1789. When the Revolutionary War began in 1776, at the beginning of this war, this is, of course, the culmination of about 13 years of conflict, of rhetoric, of discussions, of debates, of street fights, of what we could call a massacre, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, not like the Tea Party movement of today, but the Boston Tea Party. All of these things had led to this final break between England and her colonies. Now, the break actually started in many ways in the aftermath of the French and Indian War in 1763. In 1763, after England ended, after the world basically ended this fourth in a series of global conflicts, the British government is faced with two basic problems in North America. One is how to govern this huge empire that they've just acquired at the end of this war, when France is no longer in control of the territory from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. They have removed France, they've removed Spain, and England is the dominant power from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. But they have a little problem. And the problem is that basically they've been fighting for almost a century in a series of 4 conflicts that have involved most of the European powers. So England's treasury is bankrupt, and they have to figure out how will they govern all this new territory, and how will they make their empire pay. So one of the first things that they initiate is an agreement or a proclamation. They issue a proclamation that says that American settlers will not go beyond the Appalachian Mountains. This is the proclamation of 1763. Now, Americans had fought in the French and Indian War for the right to move into these territories. You had something like 1 million people clustered along the Atlantic coast, and they're very anxious to move their settlements further. England also begins to tax their people in the aftermath of this war. And for the first time, the colonists feel that they are faced with taxes that are coming directly from the British government. So you begin to hear those cries of no taxation without representation. In any event, beginning in 1763, you have this steady move toward this break between England and her colonies. And it's not an easy break. By the time you get to 1776, even after 13 years of this build-up to the war, you still have a situation where only about a third of the colonists, third of the people in the colonies, could be described as patriots. During the build-up to the war, the writers and the speakers of this period had very often tried to show similarities between what was happening with England and her colonies, and to put this in the context of what was happening in a master-slave relationship. They painted England as the tyrant and the British colonies, the colonists, as something akin to slaves. Now, when slaves heard this rhetoric, they, of course, interpreted it in their own way, that if the colonists had a right to be free, as many of their people were saying, people like James Otis, William Henry, Richard Henry Lee, if they were saying that colonists had a right to be free from tyranny, then slaves also had a right to be free from tyranny. In any event, in 1776, or by the 1770s, things have just developed to a crisis point, and there is conflict between Britain and her colonists. But it's not a conflict in the early 70s that most people thought would lead to this break, this independence movement. Most colonists just simply wanted to be heard, and most of them wanted to let the British know that they would not be taxed without what they called representation. However, by 1774, there are outbreaks of violence between the colonists and the British. And in 1774, you've got the Battle of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. And one of the things that you begin to see happening, and in fact that people had seen happen as early as 1770 with the Boston Massacre, is that African Americans are involved in this conflict. They're hearing the rhetoric, they're interpreting it in their own lives as a call for their own freedom. But they're also interpreting it, some of them, as a call for a very just freedom from the British. So they do join with the other colonial patriots in battling against the British in places like Lexington and Concord. You see blacks in the colonial militias. In Washington's Continental Army, however, Washington says, no, we're not going to accept black soldiers, slave or free, in this Continental Army as early as 1774. And he says it very simply because these colonies, these 13 colonies that are working to gain some kind of new relationship with the British, you have in all of these colonies, slavery exists in some form or the other. You have a free black population, large free black population in some places like Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, but you also have places like South Carolina, where something like 61% of the population is black. And for Washington to accept these black soldiers into his army, the Continental Army, he felt would have complicated this issue, that this was not a war over this question of slavery. However, things began to change. And they began to change when the royal governor, the colonial governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, begins to accept blacks into his militia. In the fall of 1775, several hundred slaves who had escaped two British lines, escaped from the colonists, and they came across, escaped from their plantations and their slaveholders. They came to the British, and they joined Dunmore as he was trying to, or as he did rather, flee from the colonial capital of Williamsburg, Virginia. They joined the colonial loyalists and the British regulars, and they formed a small army on Virginia's coast. Now, the blacks who joined Dunmore became known as Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. And soon after this Ethiopian regiment was formed, in November of 1775, Dunmore issued a proclamation declaring that all indentured servants and slaves, so black and white, people who are bound to service either for a certain period of time or permanently, all indentured servants, all slaves who left their masters to fight for the British Army against the rebels, the patriots, would gain their freedom. The American policy at the time, remember, was to reject black soldiers. However, after Dunmore's proclamation, Washington and the Continental Army changed their policy, and they decided that they would accept blacks into the Continental Army. So you've got now blacks fighting on both sides of this conflict. Blacks not only fought in the Continental Army, they also are accepted into the state militias in all but 2 states, Georgia and South Carolina. In every other state militia, you have blacks accepted. By the end of the war, 5,000 of the 300,000 soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War are black. When the British surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, and then in the aftermath of that, developed the Treaty of Paris of 1783, this whole question of what would happen to the blacks who had fought in the war on either side, either for the Patriots or either for the British, the question of what would happen to them was a very complex issue. Now remember that Dunmore had said, if you fight for me, then if you help us win this war, then we will set you free. The only problem was that they didn't win the war. So there is this question of, will these blacks, especially slaves who have escaped from their owners and gone to the British, will their owners be allowed to reclaim them? And many of the British Army said no. So in and around New York City, where you had a very large slave population, in Virginia, the British actually took something like 12,000 blacks with them when they left the continent. Now, where did they go? Some of these people gained their freedom as a result of this service. Let me just also say that some who had fought for the Americans also gained their freedom. But this, again, is a very complex issue because states like South Carolina and Georgia, of course, had not accepted them into their militias, and they had no intention of granting independence or freedom to blacks, even those who had not so much volunteered, but who had been enlisted as substitutes for white soldiers who had not been able to fight. So this question of, what's going to be the status of these people? Will they be freed? Will they be not? Will they not be freed? Well, back to the British again. What they did was to take those who had fought with them, to try to take them out of the country. If you look at this small map, you'll see where these people are going. Some of them are going to the West Indies, some are going to South America, some are going to Nova Scotia in Canada, and from Nova Scotia, they will eventually find their way to the west coast of Africa, to the British colony of Sierra Leone. Now, this question of slavery and freedom also became a very complex issue for other blacks who were living in other colonies, slave and free. In Massachusetts, on January 13th of 1777, blacks began to petition the state legislature, the state courts, for their freedom. There was a state constitution in Massachusetts that was written in 1780. Remember, this is before the end of the war itself. But the Massachusetts State Constitution, the new constitution of the state that is no longer the colonial constitution, contains a phrase that says that all men are born free and equal, so that slavery in effect in Massachusetts is ended for everybody. This map is pretty small, but this is the state of Massachusetts as it existed at that point. And essentially what they're saying in this state is that slavery no longer exists, but this was unique to Massachusetts and to Vermont, one other state. It's ended not through some gradual process that we'll talk about in just a minute, but through a process of immediate emancipation. Now, blacks began to wage what we could call personal battles to gain their independence. It's one thing to have something on the books, it's another to have it enforced. And a good example of this is Elizabeth Freeman. You see a portrait of her that was created or painted in the late 1700s. Elizabeth Freeman, or Mum Bet, as she was called, and her sister were slaves of a family, a Massachusetts family called the Ashley family. They had been subjected to violent attacks by Mrs. Ashley, And in the years leading up to 1776, the Mrs. Ashley's husband, Colonel Ashley, had been very actively involved as a revolutionary. So on the one side, you've got the brutal Mrs. Ashley, and on the other side, you've got the revolutionary Colonel Ashley. Mom Bet overheard conversations and these discussions of freedom and independence and tyranny. And she began to interpret this in terms of her own life. Inspired by America's fight for freedom, Mom Bet and another slave by the name of Brom took their battle for freedom, their personal freedom, to court, to the Massachusetts courts. And they won, which was very unusual. Mom Bet, after both of them had their independence recognized, Brom and Mom Bet changed her name to Elizabeth Freeman in recognition of her new status. She was a free person, a freeman. Her battle and her success actually set the stage for the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts. Another slave, put Mom Bet up here first. Another slave by the name of Quock Walker in 1783 went to court again, or also went to court, and sued for his freedom before the Massachusetts Supreme Court. And the court ruled once again that he was entitled to his freedom because, as with Mom Bet in 1781 and Quock Walker in 1780, there was a recognition that that new state constitution entitled these two people to their freedom. Now, again, free blacks and slaves fought in the Revolutionary War. People like Crispus Attucks at the Boston Massacre, Salem Poor, the Battle of Charleston, Peter Salem, Bunker Hill, Battle of Lexington, Prince Whipple, who crossed the Delaware River with George Washington, James Armstead, who was a spy for Lafayette. So, blacks, in a sense, have a stake in this conflict. They have a stake in this new revolution that has taken place and this new status for the government. They have been very active in the revolutionary period, and when the war is over, the big question is, so what is going to happen in terms of slavery in this country? Well, if you look to the population of the states at this period, you could pretty much figure out how they would deal with this issue of slavery. Some states had very small black populations as a proportion of their total population. If you look, for example, at Vermont, it's not a big state to begin with. It only has a population of 1,000 people. But of that 1,000, only 25 are black. Massachusetts, again, a small population of blacks within a very much larger population of whites and maybe some whites who are indentured servants, but a small population. New Hampshire, Rhode Island. New York has a sizable black population. In fact, it had the largest slave population outside of the state of South Carolina, I believe, or Virginia, percentage of the population there. New Jersey, let me back up, New York City, rather, had more slaves than any American city other than Charleston, South Carolina. New York City, more slaves. So it's going to be a difficult issue as to what's going to happen in a state like New York, even though we would tend to see it as this northern state, so of course they're going to be free. Well, maybe not so easily. Then if you get to the right side of this list of states, you'll see that in those southern states that are clearly slaveholding states, you have larger slave populations. Look, for example, at South Carolina. Remember I said that South Carolina's population was 61% African American, overwhelming majority of whom are slaves. Well, in the North, state legislatures began to issue orders of emancipation. In Vermont and Massachusetts, these are for immediate emancipation, as you saw in that Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. But in the other states, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey, The emancipation of this period follows a pattern of what we call gradual emancipation, in which slaves are freed if they are born after a certain date, but they must remain in service to their owners for 21 to 28 years, even though they are considered free. Now, I'll use New York as an example of this. New York passes this emancipation law, the Gradual Abolition Act, in 1799. New Jersey passes a similar act in 1804. In the New York law, children born to slave mothers after July 4th of 1799 were considered free-born, but were legally required to serve their masters for periods ranging from 21, in the case of a young woman, to 28 in the case of a young man. 21 to 28 years before their freedom, their manumission, was effective. And in that period, from the time that they're born to the time that their manumission becomes effective, their owners are in essence supposed to be training them for freedom, teaching them an occupation, teaching them a skill. New York passed additional legislation in 1817 providing for the freedom of people who were born before 1799, because, of course, that hadn't been clear. If you're born after July 4th of 1799, then you're considered free. But what about your older sister who was born 2 years before in 1797? Well, she would not be free. She would be a slave for life until New York passed that new law in 1817. Provisions of the New Jersey Act were very weak and very easily circumvented. They did not free those who were born before 1804. Those who were born after were assured that they would be servants of their masters for the next 21 years for females and 24 years for males. New Jersey slave owners resented this act. They feared the prospect of a large free black population, and they considered gradual emancipation without compensation to the owners. They considered gradual emancipation unconstitutional and financially ruinous. Many New Jersey slaveholders actually sold their slaves to buyers in the South. So even though the law says you are born free, you run the risk that between 1804 and 1825 or 1829, that you will be sold, your owner will decide to sell you to a slaveholder. In essence, you will be sold downriver. These sales increased after 1804, after the law took effect, and particularly with the abolition, because in 1808, 4 years after that, you've got the abolition of the slave trade, closing off the source of new slaves coming in. And at the same time, during this period, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, you've got the introduction of the cotton gin, making it more profitable to produce cotton. So the government has closed off further importation of slaves. The cotton gin has made it more productive, more effective to produce cotton in the South. And there's this fear that there will be a shortage of slaves. So New Jersey slaveholders took advantage of this by selling some of their slaves to the South. In 1812, the New Jersey government and New Jersey legislature passed a more stringent law, but there were still people who circumvented the law, and still slaves from New Jersey who might find themselves on plantations in Mississippi or Alabama. In the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, you have the issue of the Western Territories coming up. The Western Territories were generally those lands from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River that had been acquired by the British in the aftermath of the French and Indian War and were turned over to the Americans in the aftermath of the Revolution. So it becomes a question of what will happen. Will there be slavery in these new American territories? In 1787, Congress, the Articles of Confederation Congress, passes the Northwest Ordinance. And as a part of this, in Article 6 of the ordinance, says very simply, there will be no slavery or involuntary servitude in the territory north of the Ohio River, west of the Appalachian Mountains, and east of the Mississippi River, north of the Ohio River. It provided a fugitive slave clause whereby a person could reclaim property, slave property, that was taken away or taken into this territory. And it also provided there was a recognition that this ordinance did not include the lands to the south of the Ohio River. In other words, if you look on this map, you'll see that the state of Virginia stretches all the way across to the Mississippi. Well, in effect, it actually becomes a part of the state becomes the state of Kentucky. It is south of the Ohio River. There is no restriction on the movement of slaves into this territory. So Kentucky, the Old Southwest, part of the Old Southwest, is open to slavery. North Carolina goes all the way to the Mississippi River, but you can kind of notice, because you see Nashville there, that North Carolina, that western North Carolina becomes the territory of Tennessee. So in these areas, because they're south of the Ohio, slavery could exist and did exist. Very soon after, well, even before the ordinances were passed, even before the Revolution had started, you already had settlers who were coming into these territories west of the Appalachian Mountains, bringing slaves with them. In 1789, as a result of concerns about the possibility of a more radical revolutionary movement and more radical opposition to the government, of course, these concerns grew out of the Daniel Shays Rebellion in western Massachusetts. But as a result of this, more conservative leaders in the government decided to call a constitutional convention to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. Now, at this point, all that you have on the books as far as slavery is concerned, and I can't think of any other things to add to this, but all that you have essentially is the Northwest Ordinance concerning slavery in the territories. But you don't have anything as far as the government trying to either legislate for or against slavery. Slavery was a domestic institution. In terms of whether states would abolish slavery, you can see that this is a state matter. It's either going to be done gradually, as in New York and New Jersey, or immediately, as in Vermont and Massachusetts. Southern states may decide that they're going to make it easier for owners to free slaves who have done some great service during the Revolutionary War. But Southern states do not adopt any kind of gradual emancipation laws. They don't say anything concerning that. All right, so in 1789, when this group meets in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation, and they decide that they're going to create this whole new system of government, they have to deal with many issues. One of the first issues that they have to deal with after they make a decision that they will not revise the Articles of Confederation, that they will create a new federal system of government. One of the first things they have to deal with is the question of representation in Congress. And this becomes one of the first instances in which they have to address this issue of the existence of slavery. And they do this through the 3/5 compromise. We'll come back to a little fuller explanation of each of these in just a minute. Then as they get into the writing of the document, they have to deal with the question of trade. Should Congress be given the power to regulate the import trade as well as the export trade? A decision is made on this because when you talk about the import trade, well, obviously one of the biggest items of import trade at this point is the slave trade. And then third, on this question of the reciprocity of state laws, whether the laws of one state will apply in another state. The key question that they deal with on this one is the one in which they have to resolve some issue, some question of slavery. has to do with fugitive labor. Now, if you have your textbook handy, if you turn to the appendix in the back of your textbook, you have in the appendix, just turn to the section that has the Constitution. And what we're going to look at is how each of these provisions is applied. Now, just in case you don't have your textbook with you, Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution deals with this question of representation. And of course, this decision, this compromise, is made even before they get into the drafting of the Constitution, because they have to figure this out before there's any agreement. It is a question of big states versus small states in size and in population, wealthy states versus poor states, and the question of how do you go from this system of representation in a Congress that is equal, as with the Articles of Confederation, where each state had the same amount of representation, regardless of size, to one that seems to be more fairer and takes into consideration the representation of people rather than the representation of states. So they decide that there will be two houses to the National Congress. In the upper house, which would be the Senate, representation will continue to be equal as it was under the Articles of Confederation. But in the lower house, the question is, how do you determine representation based on population? So they decide that, especially when there are states with large slave populations that do not count slaves, then they don't have any rights for the slaves. So should they be allowed to count them in terms of representation in Congress? But they do tax slaves. Slaves are income and everything. So in Article 1, Section 2, it says, representation and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within the Union according to their respective numbers of people in the states, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, in other words, indentured servants, and excluding Indians who are not taxed. So you look at this whole population first of free people. And in this group that you consider free people, you include people who are indentured servants, but you do not include Indians. Right? Then you look at this other population that you're describing as all other persons. Now, the only other persons in the colonies at this point, other than free whites, free blacks, who would be counted as this population number of free persons, Native Americans, the only other people who are left are Indians. I'm sorry, only other people who are left are African Americans. They're slaves. All right. So this is to the whole population of free persons, each free person counting as one person, you're going to add 3/5 of all the other people. So you look at the total population of your all other people, in other words, blacks, slaves, take 3/5 of that number and add it to your whole population number. And that gives you, that will be the basis of your representation. So that a state like South Carolina with a large slave population does not benefit as greatly from having that large slave population. A state like Rhode Island that does not have a large slave population, or let's say Vermont would probably be a better example, that doesn't have a large slave population, is not penalized because they don't. You don't gain anything in terms of more numbers to go into to help boost your representation. In Article 1, Section 9, where they're dealing with this question of import taxes, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. Such persons, not slaves, such persons, shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. So Congress can do nothing to touch the slave trade until before 1808. However, Congress can a tax or duty on this importation, but it cannot exceed $10 for each person. Okay? This concerns the slave trade. You can't touch it before 1808. You can tax them, but you can't tax more than $10 a person. So you cannot tax the slave trade out of existence. And you cannot ban it through some kind of federal legislation until after 1808. What that means essentially is that from 1789 until 1808, 20 years, you have a possibility for that 20 years of slave planters, slave traders, and Southern planters being able to bring in as many slaves as they possibly can. All right, the third provision, and this one will lead to the creation of fugitive slave laws. In Article 4, Section 2, they're really looking at this question of the laws of one state being accepted or enforceable in another state, the reciprocity of state laws. And it says, no person held to service or labor in one state, if they escape to another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service. So if you are a slave or an indentured servant in South Carolina and you escape to Massachusetts, just because Massachusetts has a law that says all men are created equal, no slavery, that does not mean that you as an escaped slave or escaped indentured servant are now free. And in fact, this particular article and section will become the basis for the fugitive slave laws. Constitution provides the legal framework. Congress passes the laws. And in 1793, they passed the first federal Fugitive Slave Act, which was then signed by George Washington. The law established the legal mechanism by which escaped slaves could be seized in any state, brought before a legal official, a magistrate or a judge, and returned to their masters. It gave the states the right to demand a slave be returned to his owner. The law made it a crime to assist a slave or fugitive in escaping. And it made every escaped slave or fugitive for life. Every escaped slave is a fugitive for life. If you escape, you will always, until you are returned to your owner, be considered a fugitive. Now, what did the black population, look like by 1800? Well, if you look at this map, you get some idea of those numbers. Slave, free black, and white. By 1790, blacks were 750, let me give you the percentages. 1790, they are 19.3% of the total population. Most blacks are living in the former southern colonies, now southern states, that darker, deeper, not red, but maybe pink, dark pink or whatever, on the map. And the new states and territories that are south of the Ohio River, the old Southwest Territory. Virginia had the largest black population. South Carolina came next. If you look on this, you see Virginia's black population. Let's see, where would it be? I think it's divided into eastern and western on here. But you can see how large their black population is. South Carolina, further south, has the second largest black population. Tennessee and Kentucky are not states yet, but you see a growing slave population in those areas. In New England, by 1790, slavery was declining as a result of immediate emancipation in Massachusetts and Vermont, and gradual emancipation in the other states. Blacks were developing cultural institutions like churches and mutual aid societies and schools in the northern cities, northern areas, but also in some urban areas in the South, like Charleston, South Carolina. By 1800, which is the map that you're looking at now, blacks were 18.9% of the population. nearly 50%, they were nearly 50% of the population in the slaveholding states in the South. The majority were freeborn. So the whole idea of ending the slave trade is not a difficult decision for states or the federal government to arrive at, because the black population is increasing through natural increase, not the continued importation of Africans into the U.S. In Tennessee, which achieved statehood in 1790, the population by 1800, if you look over to Tennessee, 91,000 plus whites, 13,500 blacks, and only 309 free blacks out of this whole Tennessee population. So you can see what we're going to be looking at when we get into the new century as it develops. Okay, we'll stop at this point, and we'll take the next lecture. We'll focus in Module 5 on slavery in the antebellum South.